Final Fantasy is a franchise that I truly fell in love with when I first got my hands on Final Fantasy VIII back in, I believe it was 1998. I remember playing Final Fantasy 1 as a kid, but the game was a little bit too complicated considering I couldn't read yet, so I stuck with, well, Dragon Warrior. Because you only had one character, there wasn't as much you had to be concerned about in terms of like armor and stuff. You could just grind and eventually force your way to the finish. With Final Fantasy, there was a ton of party management, a lot more equipment you had to deal with, and a bunch of magic you had to buy and stuff like that. Well, fast forward years later, I'm in junior high school, and a friend of mine is telling me about how incredible Final Fantasy VII is. I head on down to Walmart to pick myself up a copy, only to find out that the latest Final Fantasy VIII is out, and according to the Walmart employee that I spoke with, is even better. Now, most people would laugh at this, but Final Fantasy VIII is actually the one that got me into the series, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But after finishing 8, I remember like Final Fantasy Tactics coming out, Final Fantasy Origins coming out on the PlayStation 1, which was Final Fantasies 1 and 2. And then, of course, I got my hands on Final Fantasy Chronicles, which was Final Fantasy 4, and Chrono Trigger, two of my favorite games of all time. And then eventually, Final Fantasy Anthology, which was Final Fantasy 5 and Final Fantasy 6. Growing up with a PlayStation 1, I got to experience the absolute peak of the franchise, and nowadays, Final Fantasy is kind of a shadow of what it once was. Is that because it's no longer turn-based? Have they alienated their fan base too much? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today. In an interview a couple years ago, before Final Fantasy 16 came out, Yoshi P went on to say how he himself was a fan of turn-based and command battle menu JRPGs. But because of realistic graphics, he felt that going to turn-based just didn't make any sense, because it was ridiculous to have realistic graphics and a turn-based combat system. Well, fast forward to today where everyone's celebrating the success of Clair Obscur Expedition 33 and its excellent turn-based combat, I think he's got to eat those words. Expedition 33 sports some incredible graphics, and with a core development team of only around 30 people, this game is showing gigantic game developers like Square Enix how it should be done. Now, is it because the game's turn-based that the game's incredible? Not entirely, but Expedition 33 was made by a team of developers that fell in love with the same turn-based JRPG games that I did. And they got tired of these big developers just chasing trends and forcing games out that really didn't have too much to do with the classics that we all know and love. They said so themselves, that they got tired of not being able to play the type of games that they loved growing up playing. And that because of modern graphics, or whatever excuse you want to use, the way JRPGs function today is completely different than it was back then. And that honestly really started back on the PS2. My favorite game of all time is Dragon Quest XI. But even that game is lacking in what I would call like a world map kind of overworld situation. You've got what's called like open zones, but it's not really open world. You know what I mean? Not that there's anything wrong with open zones, but there's just something about exploring the open world map that always appealed to me, and I was so excited to see it return in Expedition 33. When I went into Expedition 33, I went in as blind as possible. I saw like the original announcement trailer and avoided everything else. So I didn't know that there was going to be a world map. And when I got out of that first series of areas and saw that there was a freaking world map, I was losing my mind. This is like classic NES through PS1 era JRPGs at its finest. And I feel like that magic is just completely gone nowadays. You've got Dragon Quest XI, which pretty much captures that magic, but we're talking about the Final Fantasy series here, which has completely deviated from the sense of exploration, the charm, and love that the developers had for the series originally. Look at something like Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy IX or even Final Fantasy VI. You're constantly getting like vehicle upgrades, which allow you to explore new parts of the world map and explore new areas, towns, go on new quests, and meet new people. This is something that's pretty much removed from most modern Final Fantasy games. In fact, since Final Fantasy 13, there's barely been any towns in the Final Fantasy franchise. A lot of people will say Yoshi P saved the franchise, and To a degree, it's true, because Final Fantasy XIV is very successful. The subscription service of Final Fantasy XIV has been pretty much carrying the franchise at this point, which is kind of sad. But even like Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, you didn't have free roaming exploration. You were pretty much stuck to where you could explore down these like narrow corridors. You go off the beaten path every now and then, get some treasure. In fact, Final Fantasy XIII didn't really have any towns that I remember that you could actually even go in. You could talk to your save point and buy items from that, and that's about it. To me, the towns, the communities, the cultures, the exploration all adds to the sense of adventure that these JRPGs had. And I think getting rid of those is a bigger detriment to the franchise than switching from turn-based combat. But turn-based combat is a big part of this as well. Turn-based combat lets you have a full party of characters. I don't want to follow just one grizzled dude in combat who has a small set of action RPG combos that you have to use for the entirety of the game. I want a great cast of characters that I have an influence in controlling. To me, Final Fantasy XV actually had an interesting party of characters. I would have liked to have more control over them, but the action combat in the Final Fantasy series isn't just bad because it's action combat. It's bad because it's kind of bad. There's not a lot that it actually adds to any of the games. You can pull off a lot more cooler moves with something like an overdrive system from Final Fantasy X. Another issue that the Final Fantasy series has been struggling with since it's switched to like action combat, or even before that with like the weird action time battle that Final Fantasy XIII had, is padded out enemies, man. There's this artificial lengthening of the games. The whole stagger system to me is an absolute disaster. Take something like Final Fantasy IX again, which is one of my favorite games of all time. If you're an adequate level, you should be able to do away with random encounters in like one full party turn at the very least. In games like Final Fantasy XIII or even Final Fantasy VII Remake, even if you're at an adequate level for that part of the game, all these encounters take way too much time because you have to stagger them in order to do any significant amount of damage. It's so frustrating. Stagger should be a bonus. It shouldn't be something that's mandatory in order to actually deal a decent amount of damage to these enemies. It's just artificial padding that this entire franchise is known for now. Give me good content. The game doesn't even have to be 30 hours long. That was one of my biggest complaints with Final Fantasy VII Remake. It could have been like a 12-hour game if it felt tight. The combat system's not awful. It's the fact that all the enemies are padded out and there's so much padding in like the plot and the side quests that really ruin the experience in my opinion. And the same goes for Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XVI. I'm not a big MMO fan, but I put about 30 hours in Final Fantasy XIV to see how Yoshi P saved the franchise. And honestly, there were so many fetch quests that contributed absolutely nothing to the story, to the world, to anything, to my enjoyment. There was no enjoyment from doing these side quests. It was nothing but padding out time, trying to make you feel like you were getting your money's worth because you were spending more time in this game, and then gently skirting you off to the next main story event. Meanwhile, you've got games like Final Fantasy IX, again, that have meaningful side quests, like the Chocobo side story, getting all like the chocographs and learning about the origins of the Chocobo and how you can upgrade them and evolve them into more powerful versions of themselves, and eventually reach what is essentially Chocobo heaven in the sky and facing off against Ozma. I guess my main issue here is Final Fantasy has been just making change for the sake of change. I think they've just been like chasing trends to try and like cash in, but they're always way too late on the trends anyways. So what's the point? Do I think Final Fantasy should turn back to turn-based? Absolutely. All the classics are turn-based. People love these games and have loved them for decades now. And I think focusing on a more simple combat system, or even evolving that combat system into something a little bit more unique, like what Expedition 33 did, would allow them to focus more on developing the world, developing a better story, developing a more openness to that world. You don't have to spend all this time messing around with a combat system. You had it there all along. You had a great combat system right from the beginning. Don't worry too much about that. Focus on what matters. Focus on the adventure, the characters, how the characters interact with one another, the storytelling. Focus on that. That's what we want. We don't care if a game doesn't look ridiculous because the party members are standing there waiting for the enemy to attack and then taking their turn afterwards. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Expedition 33's proved that. I just want an excellent story, an excellent world that I want to explore and learn more about, and a great cast of characters, all with their own unique skills, abilities, and personalities. Is that too much to ask? Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Should Final Fantasy go back to turn-based? Should Final Fantasy go back to focusing more on a world that we want to learn about, that we want to explore, and the freedom to explore it with an overworld map? Or do you think they should continue the path they're currently on, sticking to action combat, continuing to alienate their original fan base in hopes that they'll gain a new one? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like, subscribe, turn notifications to all so you don't miss the next one, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. See ya.